Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish, and we are on week 4 of English 122. So I hope you all had a great Labor Day weekend. I know I'm posting this on Monday night, which is a little bit later than usual, but I hope you all had a great weekend. And we are going to finish up this week. We're going to finish up talking about fiction in terms of the PowerPoints and the terminology, and then there's going to be 2 assignments this week, and then next week, in week 5, we're going to finish up prose. I usually give you all an extended amount of time on this first paper and on the fourth paper. Papers 2 and 3 we go through a lot quicker. The reason why is because obviously the fourth paper is a bit longer, so we give you more time to work on that. But I like to have us start out slow in the semester because I know everybody's getting their textbooks, you're getting adjusted to online classes if you've never taken one especially, and then just making sure you get the format and the flow of the class down. So after this week and next week, things are going to pick up the pace just a bit. But for this week, I want to go over the assignments and then finish talking about the terminology for our prose chapters. So first I want to go over here to course content and talk about what's due this week for week 4. So there are 2 assignments due. The first assignment is your discussion forum, which posts are due Friday, responses are due Sunday, and I'll show you all that forum here in a moment. And then the other assignment is our reading response number 2. Now the first reading response we did was out of your textbook. It was Over Hills Like White Elephants. That is not the case with this week's reading response. What we're doing this week is looking at this video. It's called Stranger Things, It, and the Upside Down of Nostalgia. So Lindsay Ellis, she is a video essayist. She has her degree in film and theater studies. I really like her work because she's very analytical and she really breaks down things, but does it in like a fun, cool pop culture way. So what she's doing is analyzing how we view nostalgia and how it affects the media and the texts that we consume and trends and things that go along with that. So if you're taking Mr. Cummins's film appreciation course, COM 128, you'll probably see some topics or terms come up here that will relate to that. But I also wanted to show this video because it does talk about prose. It does talk about trends in literature and things that come up like that. So I thought it would be cool to watch. So for the reading response, you just watch this video, and then there are 3 questions that your reading response will answer. So talking about what the thesis or topic is, how it relates to originality, what is the 30-year cycle, do you agree with her views, and then examples of nostalgia that you see in culture now. So it's going to be a little bit of an example analysis, but that's our reading response too. That's going to be due on Sunday. As far as the discussion forum goes, for week 4, and I'll go up here, basically there is an excerpt. It's from one of my favorite, it's probably my favorite nonfiction book. It's Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. It's about the Chicago World's Fair back in 1893. And basically it follows the construction of the World's Fair, but also simultaneously while the World's Fair is going on, there is a serial killer loose in Chicago, H.H. Holmes, it's a crazy story. It's all true. And this excerpt, The Necessary Supply, is the opening chapter of that story. So if you click on the PDF here, you'll notice it's taking a long time to load. So don't get discouraged if your file says it's taking a while. And also, if you don't have Adobe Acrobat, you might need to download it so that you can open and read the PDFs. But once it gets loaded, and you can see it's taking its time, but once the file does get loaded, the link that I clicked on, you can see that it's 13 pages. It's an excerpt from the opening section, but it's introducing us to H.H. Holmes, who is our serial killer, and talking about his relation to the city. So it's a fascinating account, but I want to know in our discussion forum after you read the excerpt kind of the differences between fiction and nonfiction, what the strongest element of fiction used in the excerpt is and why. And then I want you to choose a story from our textbook that you think is either similar or different from the excerpt, and I want you to explain to me why it's either similar or different. So there's a lot of options you can pick, and usually this discussion forum gets us a lot of varied responses. So I'm really excited to see what you all decide to pick for that one. But anyway, those are the 2 assignments for this week, and of course to continue working on your first paper leading up to this. So keep working on paper 1. You've got your reading response and a discussion forum due. In our textbook, we're finishing our last 2 chapters on prose, which are theme and style today. And then they're on pages 261 to 263 and 309 to 320. And then in the Cengage handbook, there's a section on drafting and revising. We're going to talk about revising next week in the lecture video, but I want you to go ahead and check out those pages 35 to 63 if you've not already checked them out for English 121. But we'll talk about revising and things next week too. So this is just to preface it. But anyway, we are going to today finish up talking about the elements of prose. So our last 2 chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8. Chapter 7 starts on page 261 and deals with theme. And so theme is pretty easy to understand. Theme is just what is the meaning behind the story. Like, what do you want readers to get from the story? What do you want to take with them? Do you want them to learn anything? What is the overall impression that they are supposed to get from your story? So that is the first part of theme. But also there's things that you have to be aware of and to beware with theme. And there's 3 main ones that our text talks about. There are large abstractions. So things are overgeneralized. Your audience may be like, okay, what's the point? Or they may not think that your theme, they may think it's too vague and not specific enough. There's also the opposite of abstraction, which is oversimplification, meaning that your theme's too simple. Your audience may think that you're dumbing down the theme for them, or that they're not being treated as mature of an audience. And so that's something to watch out for. And then finally, you want to kind of avoid cliches. I mean, cliches and archetypes can be helpful when you're trying to establish a character or a plot point, but you don't want your theme to just be like, love conquers all, and not have anything else added to it. I mean, you want them to be a bit more complex if that's the case with your audience. Long story short, theme is about a delicate balance. You need to understand your audience and know who they are. If your audience are adults, you need to kind of tailor your story for that. If they're for children, you need to be aware in that case too. You want to challenge your audience and make them think, but you don't want to confuse them or to oversimplify things. So it's kind of, theme can be a bit more complex than it lets on, but it's a very, very crucial part of the story, because if your story doesn't have a point, why does your audience need to read it? That's pretty important to think about. And then the final chapter on prose is about style. And I love the chapter on style, because style is where authors really get to kind of come into their own, and there's no wrong way of doing it. It's just a matter of consistency. So style is just the way that you use language to create your story. And starting on page 308, this chapter kind of starts talking about the idea of, it helps to set the mood, the style does. How you present the text has a big impact on how your audience will react to it. So if you start this grandiose fantasy story with all this world building, then your audience needs to be on board with that for it to work. The same thing goes if you're being very minimalist, then there needs to be like a hook or a catch or something to draw the reader in. So style has the most variation to it and the most options, but I would say that style is probably the least pertinent to making a good story. You've got to have a plot, you've got to have a setting, you've got to have characters. Style is so subjective that it really just depends on what the author is wanting to do. So types of style on page 310. These are 3 popular types of styles that are used by authors. There is the style of understatement, not to be confused with minimalism. And that's where an author uses minimal or simplistic language to fill in the blanks for the readers. It's just making things seem simple. A good example of this is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. I love this book. It deals with time travel, but a lot of the story takes place during World War II. One of the things I love the most about this story is that whenever something really serious happens and something can be gruesome or hard for a reader to digest, the author or the narrator goes, so it goes. Like, just say, what can we do? Because a lot of the story takes place during World War II, so there's themes of war and death. And when there's something that you're just like, man, this is heavy, the author's like, so it goes. Like, it's just part of the lifestyle in that era. And so it's an understatement. It's a really powerful line that has a lot of emotional context, but it's just casually stated there. Like, it's just a stylistic choice. Formal is the opposite of understatement. It's very lavish and flowery, and it's very pretentious. Elevated language and vocabulary to describe the story in great detail. I'm not a big Charles Dickens fan because I think he does formal language so much that for me, it bogs down the pacing sometimes of a story. I want him to just hurry up and get the plot going, and instead he wants to spend 3 pages describing the house that the character lives in. And I'm like, just get on with it. I feel like that audience in the Monty Python film, like the mob that's like, get on with it. Like, that's how I feel watching that or reading those stories by him. So, but that's a formal style. It's very verbose, very lavish, very extraneous amounts of text to describe in detail the settings, the characters, etc. And then finally there's hyperbole, which is an exaggeration of language, which is used to grab an audience's attention. And this can be very subtle or you wouldn't think hyperbole would be subtle, but an example of that is if you actually read Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling uses hyperbole a bit in formatting the text. So when a character is yelling, normally in a story, we just have an exclamation point, and that's all that there is. But in Harry Potter, when a character is yelling, it's in all caps with like huge emphasis drawn to it that you really get the idea that yes, they are yelling. And that's not a very common formatting. But Rowling does it and it works. But that's an example of hyperbole. Abstract versus concrete. We've talked a little bit about this. This will be something that I ask you on your final exam. Concrete are tangible items that we find in reality. These can be chairs, hair, earth, lava. Abstract are non-tangible things. We can't touch, see them, or smell them. They're just like emotions or feelings, like freedom, happiness. They're things that are different for everyone. Like a desk, no matter who you are, a desk is the same, right? But a concept like happiness can be different for each of us. So that's how you can differentiate abstract versus concrete, literal versus figurative. Also, we have denotation versus connotation. These are just ways in which words are given meaning. So with denotation, it's the dictionary definition. When I think denotation, I think dictionary because it's very matter of fact. It's the exact meaning. So like a flag. What is a flag? Well, by definition, a flag is a piece of fabric that has a color and a pattern on it, and it's usually attached to a wooden or metal pole. That's a flag. Connotation is the emotional or symbolic meaning behind the word. So connotatively, a flag represents a country or a culture or cultural pride or a lawful state, something like that. It has an emotional meaning and not just its definition. So that's denotation versus connotation. And again, both those terms will also be on your prose exam. I said literal versus figurative and metaphor versus similes. Literal, when somebody's like, I am literally, I'm thinking of Rob Lowe in Parks and Rec, I am literally a microchip. Literal is something that's actually there, and figurative is implied but not necessarily real. Like when you're like, oh well, I'm starving, literally, like that means you literally haven't eaten any food. But if you're like, oh, figuratively speaking, I could eat a horse. I couldn't, and I don't want to, but just it's implied how hungry I am. That's figurative versus literal. Metaphors and similes mean the exact same thing. The only difference is the word use. And I feel that we use similes much more than metaphors because for some reason in the last 10 years, the word like has just invaded our vocabulary. The Valley Girl like has invaded. So a simile is a comparison of two or more things using the word like or as. So if I say, she's like the wind, she's not actually the wind, it's just a comparison. If I say, he was acting like a child, that's a simile. Metaphor compares two or more things, just like a simile, but it does not use like or as. And they're a little bit harder to come up with. So you could say, his room was a pigsty. That's a metaphor. All the world's a stage. That's a metaphor. It's just a comparison, but you don't use the word like or as. Dialogue in stories. Dialogue is a stylistic choice. Your story does not have to have dialogue to function. But if you do use dialogue, it can be very important or necessary to help move the plot along, flesh out your characters, explain motives, themes, etc. When writing dialogue, make sure that you use the proper punctuation. And in this slideshow, I've shown you all, like you can see, here's where the comma goes inside the quotation marks. The punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. Format your dialogue like this, and it will be correct. Parallelism and sentimentality are on pages 312. Parallelism is just a stylistic choice where an author starts a story out one way, either whether it's grammatically or through the elements of fiction, and then they create this kind of like rhythmic effect where it ends kind of on the same note. So, for example, in Lord of the Rings, in the Fellowship of the Ring, the hobbits start out leaving the Shire together, and they leave the Shire as a group. And then at the end of the story, end of Return of the King, they all come back to the Shire as a group. So it's a little bit of a parallelism. The things that are different, though, is that their mentality is different from when they started to when they come back. But that's a parallel situation. And then sentimentality is deliberately making your audience feel sad or pity for a character. And a lot of texts will really drive in that sentimentality to try to make us feel sorry for characters and have an emotional connection to them. So here are some examples of parallelism and sentimentality in film, and also text. For parallelism, there's a movie called Grave of the Fireflies. It's a beautiful movie. It's animated. It's not for kids. It's about World War II and these two kids that because of a bombing, they get stuck growing up together alone during the war. It's a very, very sad movie. But the opening shots here, these shots here start out the movie, and these shots here end the movie. And you can tell just without knowing the context of the film that the scenes are very similar in how they start and how they end. Sentimentality, I use John Wick. You don't think of John Wick as being this sentimental movie, but that puppy in the beginning that was given to him by his wife, and what happens to that puppy, that is sentimentality at its finest. They are wanting us to feel bad for John Wick's character in that opening scene, and it works. It's a very good example of sentimentality. The stuff that comes after that, it's not very sentimental, but that moment there is meant to get and elicit an emotional response from us, the audience, and it works. So in chapter 8, you'll notice in our textbook cannot decide how to define irony. It really struggles with it. And irony is very hard to define. So our textbook, throughout the course of this semester, you'll notice that our textbook keeps trying to define irony in various ways. And so in chapter 8, our textbook defines irony as the sad and comic contrast between expectation of an event and between the ideal and reality. So we expect things to go one way and they do not, they go the opposite, or they go in a variation of that. So I tried to find an example that is similar to our textbook's definition of irony in chapter 8, and what I found was this scene from a movie called 500 Days of Summer. And what it is that our main character has fallen in love with this girl named Summer, and he's fallen in love with this girl named Summer, and he's kind of had an argument with her, and he's deciding that he's going to go back and get back together with her after this argument. He realizes he's messed up, and he's going to try to win her back. So she invites him to a party, and that's when he thinks he's going to show up and has a prediction of how things are going to go. So in this short clip, we're going to see how expectation and reality do not line up. And I really like how this movie does this scene, because they put them simultaneously side by side so that we, the audience, can see expectation versus reality. And I want to show you guys this because I think it's just a really good example.
So, Tom, what is it that you do?
I write greeting cards.
Tom could be a really great architect if he wanted to be.
That's unusual. I mean, what made you go from one to the other?
I guess I just figured, why make something disposable like a building when you can make something that lasts forever, like a greeting card?
So yeah, the idea of expectation versus reality there. I just like how it's encapsulated in that scene. So, the last two parts that they talk about for us, there's a couple terms here. On page 315, they talk about postmodernism, which is a relatively new concept that's just come around the last century. And when you think about it, literature back in, let's take Victorian times, 1800s, there wasn't such a thing as Victorian literature. It was just literature. So around the 1900s, as the printing press and as commercialism of text became more available to the masses, we started to categorize and label different genres of writing. And so postmodernism is a recognition that these genres exist. And it's the idea that when authors create texts, they kind of have an idea of what they're already writing. So if I went to sit down and write a crime noir, I know the traditions and the expectations that a crime noir would have in it. Whereas 300 years ago, you just wrote something. You just wrote a story. There wasn't a categorization of it. So postmodernism is just kind of an understanding that you know what you're writing. It's kind of like an awareness. And then the last slide here is on page 331, the idea of absurd versus surreal. And I tried to find some fun examples here. Absurd and surreal are very similar, but there are little subtle differences. Absurd is when elements are out of place in the reality of the story. So they're real elements, they're just not in the right place. So I think of SpongeBob because there are sponges, there are starfish, there are overalls and jeans, but they're usually not on fish. So there are real elements in this scene here, but they're all out in the wrong context. Like the sponge and the starfish in a burgermobile is not something that would realistically happen. There are things that could exist in reality, just not in this context. And then surreal, on the other hand, is dreamlike and hallucinogenic. So things that you can't find in reality. So Alice in Wonderland's a good example of this. The example I list here is of a heffalump from Winnie the Pooh. There's no such thing as a heffalump. It's kind of like their play on an elephant, but it's like it being a clear body and consuming honey out of a jar and the honey filling it up like that. That's not something you'd find in reality. So it's very surreal and kind of dreamlike in its nature. But that's chapter 7 and 8. So hopefully you all have been able to watch these presentations and get some context about the terminology. Next week, I'll talk about the exam. We'll talk about our paper 1, about revising, things like that. But in the meantime, if you all have any questions, please feel free to let me know, as always. But otherwise, you all have been doing a great job in the course. Keep up the hard work. Stay safe this week. And as always, I'll talk to you all again soon. Have a great week. Bye.